The restaurant fell silent. Glasses froze mid-air. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. At the center of it all, a young black waitress named Lila had just grabbed the CEO's wife, Grace Whitmore, a poised white woman in pearls, and dragged her across the polished marble floor. The gasp that followed echoed through the hall like thunder. "Security!" someone shouted, but before they could move, Lila's trembling voice cut through the noise. "Don't touch her," she said, her chest heaving. Eyes locked on Grace's purse that had fallen open, spilling its contents across the floor. Grace struggled, furious. "You're finished. Do you have any idea who I am?" Lila's hands shook, but her voice stayed firm. "Yes, ma'am," she said softly. "But do you know who that is?" Everyone turned toward the little boy sitting by the window, pale and silent, clutching his throat. Just minutes earlier, everything had been picked. It was a charity dinner at Whitmore Holdings, hosted by Grace and her husband, Daniel Whitmore, one of the most powerful CEOs in the city. The ballroom shimmered with candlelight and soft jazz. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, silver trays glinting under chandeliers. Lila had been serving quietly all night, polite, composed, invisible. She didn't expect anyone to notice her, not the way Grace did. Grace's attention had lingered on her too long. Maybe it was the way Lila smiled at Daniel when pouring his drink. Or maybe it was because Lila's skin, warm and dark against the white uniform, made her stand out in a room that rarely saw faces like hers. When Lila returned to clear a table, Grace's tone turned sharp. "Be careful," she hissed. "That's a $5,000 glass. Try not to drop it this time." Lila nodded gently. "Of course, ma'am." But the next moment, a small crash. A glass slipped from the edge, shattered. Lila froze. Grace's eyes narrowed. "You people," Grace muttered under her breath, "always breaking what doesn't belong to you." Lila blinked. She had heard the words clearly. The nearby guests pretended not to. "I'm sorry," Lila whispered, stooping to pick up the shards. Daniel, seeing the tension, rose halfway from his chair. "Grace, that's enough," he said quietly. But Grace waved him off with a tight smile. "No, darling, let her learn some manners." That's when Daniel's son, 12-year-old Ethan, appeared from the hallway, rubbing his eyes. He had been resting after feeling unwell earlier that evening. "Dad, I don't feel good," he said weakly. Grace frowned. "Go sit, sweetheart. I'll call the driver soon." The boy sat at a side table, pale and sweating. Lila's eyes darted toward him. His lips had turned faintly blue. "Ma'am," she said, voice trembling, "I think he's having an allergic reaction." Grace rolled her eyes. "He's fine. He always gets like that after dessert." "No," Lila whispered urgently, stepping closer. "I saw him eat a chocolate truffle." "Did it have peanuts?" Grace's hand froze mid-air. "Of course not," she began, but stopped. Her purse, still on the table, held a box of imported chocolates she'd brought from home earlier that night. Lila's pulse quickened. "Those are Belgian pralines. They do have nuts." Before Grace could react, Ethan's throat tightened. He gasped, clutching his neck. Chairs scraped back. Voices rose. Chaos. Grace panicked, dropping her bag and rushing toward him. "Call 911. He's allergic." And that's when Lila saw it. Grace's lying inside the open purse, still capped. Without thinking, Lila shoved past her, yanked the pen free, and as Grace screamed, Lila dragged her aside to clear the space, forcing her down and steadying the boy. "Move," she cried. The restaurant froze again as Lila knelt beside Ethan, injecting the EpiPen into his thigh. Seconds stretched like hours. Then, a faint breath. Ethan coughed, air returning to his lungs, color creeping back into his cheeks. Grace stood trembling, tears streaking her makeup. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at Lila, the waitress she had humiliated minutes earlier, who now sat on the floor, shaking, whispering, "You're okay. You're okay, baby." Daniel rushed over, pulling his son into his arms. "What happened?" Lila explained everything. Her brother had died years ago from the same allergy. That's why she'd noticed the signs so fast. "I couldn't let him." She stopped, voice breaking. Daniel looked at her, eyes full of shock and gratitude. Grace, meanwhile, sank into a chair, guilt flooding her expression. The room stayed silent until Daniel finally said, "You saved his life." Grace's lip trembled. She turned toward Lila, whispering, I'm sorry." Lila just nodded quietly, still holding back tears. A moment later, the paramedics arrived and confirmed what everyone already knew. If Lila hadn't acted, Ethan wouldn't have made it. As they took the boy to the hospital for monitoring, Grace stayed behind, staring at the untouched desert table. Her reflection in the silver platters looked like a stranger's. One of the guests murmured. She dragged her across the floor to save her son. Hours later, the hospital waiting room was quiet. Grace sat alone, her designer heels kicked off, hands trembling around a paper cup of coffee. When Lila walked in, wearing her old jacket now instead of the uniform, Grace stood immediately. "I don't have words," Grace said, voice cracking. "I treated you like you were less than me, and you still saved my family." Lila gave a tired smile. "You don't owe me anything, ma'am. Just treat people kindly. You never know what they're carrying." Grace's eyes filled. "I will, I promise." Just then, Daniel appeared, holding Ethan's hand. The boy looked healthier, smiling shyly. He stepped forward and hugged Lila's leg. "Thank you," he whispered. Lila's eyes glistened. "You're welcome, sweetheart." Daniel looked at her, his tone full of quiet awe. "You didn't just save my son. You saved us from becoming people we'd be ashamed of." As they left the hospital together, Grace paused by the door. For the first time, she reached out, not to correct, not to command, but to hold Lila's hand. The morning light streamed in through the glass, soft and forgiving. And in that silence, one truth became clear. Sometimes, the ones we look down on are the ones who lift us up when we fall. We are all equal as human beings. Kindness has no color, and compassion sees no status. Hate divides, but love, humility, and courage heal everything.